went through your mom or your sister?
No, but over the years, there were hints. But I guess they basically brushed it off. The hints were everywhere, but they're my family. They try to not look at it.
911, location of emergency.
Yes, ma'am. Someone just knocked on my door. He's here at my door right now, and he wanted me to call 911 because he said he just murdered someone.
Okay, and he's there right now?
Yes, ma'am, and I'm scared.
And he said he murdered someone?
Yes.
Okay, is there any way that maybe I can speak to him?
Would you like to talk to 911 on the phone?
Hello?
Yeah, what's going on, sir?
Oh, as I said, I murdered someone, actually.
I'm fascinated by the more artistic ways of murder, the way they cut them open, just slice them to pieces. I mean, such care, such love.
Detective Ramiro Torres, Detective Richard Garcia. Why are you here? What happened? Tell us what happened.
Well, has anybody gone to the house yet?
We know what we have, but we want to hear it from you.
Oh, we have an idea. You don't want to look at that. Start at the beginning, man. What caused all this?
The very beginning, I asked my mother for permission to die, or rather kind of commit suicide. Because, well, that doesn't really matter why I wanted to kill myself.
Sure it does.
I'm bored with life. I don't like life. I don't like people. I don't like living it, basically. There's really anything depressing about it. It just is what it is. And so I wrote the note.
So this note is titled Life Resignation Notice. Sorry for the bathroom mess, Mother. Good luck recovering from the shock, you too. When he says good luck recovering from the shock, he's taking pleasure in knowing the pain that his mother and his sister are going to experience. This makes the suicide not about him, but rather about the pain it's going to inflict on his family members. Until he decides it's a better idea and more hurtful to just kill them.
And then on a whim, actually, I turned it over, wrote a plan to kill both my mother and my sister.
We're looking at a murder plan. Kill mother with garrote. Afterwards, prepare to leave for good. Wait until nightfall. Go to sis' apartment and kill her, anyone else in the way. Leave for the Greyhound bus ASAP. Victory. So he shows a level of organization and planning and obsession.
Wrote a plan to kill both my mother and my sister. That's always been a thing of mine. I'm a bit of a pervert. And we used to have a gray cat named Claire. I strangled it, I drowned it, and then I cut it open, and you know the rest. You kind of get the rest.
In the sort of postscript of this letter, he says, I killed that stupid gray cat because I was bored one day, sorry. He's saying, oh, this is what I do when I'm bored. So imagine what I do when I'm not bored.
They're my family. Family looks past that kind of stuff, or they try to not look at it.
It's kind of funny how you never really know someone, not even your own son or brother.
How long have you had this thought you in?
It's around my preteens, actually.
you ever seek any kind of medical attention, psychological?
Nope, I never really seeked help, actually. I just accepted it as a part of me. I wasn't really ashamed of it. It just was what it was.
Shame, guilt, remorse deter us from doing terrible things because we don't want to feel guilty, we don't want to feel ashamed. Psychopaths generally will not experience these emotions, and so the shame that would generally come with doing something terrible or wanting to do something terrible just doesn't exist.
Kevin Davis talks about how he feels disconnected from everyone. He's aware of it, and it bothers him. Psychopaths would not be bothered that they're disconnected. In fact, they may not even notice that they're disconnected because they typically tend to be popular, because they're charming. Kevin Davis is not charming. He's not interested in impressing anybody. What he shows is disinterest. He's absolutely not interested in neither criticism nor praise. The police detectives don't know what to do with him. He is not that interested in what they have to say. He's detached. And detachment you see in psychopathy, but you also see it in some other kinds of manifestations. So he shows a lot of signs of being schizoid. It's a particular kind of personality disorder where you have no interest in relationships. You will not have close friends. You have no interest in any activities. You're not curious about anything. Nothing really turns you on. And perhaps he's both a little bit schizoid and a little bit psychopathic. One possibility is the mom noticed very early that he just wasn't fitting in. This was a child who was a loner, didn't socialize, was not interested in friendships.
His relationships really seemed to be limited to his mother and his sister, and so his aggression was thus targeted at them.
She said, basically, I'm a grown man, and what I do, she can't really stop me. She was distraught over it, of course.
Of course.
She had decided she was sick of this stuff, and she was going to go send me to live with my sister again.
We're looking at a text message from mom to the daughter. I could tell you so much that I've told him. Exactly what you just said. I'm just tired, not so much physical, both. Living with someone with a serious mental illness or who's very disturbed is draining, and she's a single mom. She's absolutely exhausted.
And so I kind of left off in a fury and just did it right then and there.
Okay, you did what?
Well, I tried to strangle her with a cord. A ripped cord from a video game console controller. That didn't work, huh?
What was your thought of strangler?
She was sitting on the couch watching TV.
Okay.
Psychopaths do have lower impulse control, and it didn't seem like he really thought through this plan very well, evidenced by his initial attempt to kill her failing. He didn't really think through what was about to happen.
That didn't work out too well. She started screaming.
Right.
She grabbed the cord, so I raced back into her room, opened a drawer at the very bottom to the right. I pulled out a hammer. I went back in the living room, and, well, you kind of get the gist from there. And, she was out pretty quickly. Kind of tried to play dead at first.
How many times did you hit with a hammer in the living room?
At least 20. But then she was still alive. I dragged her into the room, as you clearly saw. I just knew it was time to act now or never.
I tell you what, give me your fantasy of killing a woman.
This is a little peculiar. I'm on camera. Okay,
He's never actually talked to anybody about these things. So there may be a hesitation in, oh, actually, is it okay that I'm on camera? No, I don't actually care. I can't wait to talk about it.
maybe dressing up in a a nice suit, sneaking into her house, disabling her boyfriend. You know, yeah, I'd bring a pretty dress with me to dress her up in. I was always into strangling, but I guess maybe something big and sharp would be more along my thing. And then I'd go to town, and it would be a night to remember. Mm-hmm. And then I'd kind of just burn everything and run for the hills.
He's had this fantasy for a long time and has thought it through. There's a couple of things which are really interesting. And one is the need to be well-dressed. And so everyone in the scene is going to be well-dressed. He's going to be in a suit.
For him, it's a means of control. Psychopaths tend to like to manipulate people and play games with people because it's a way of fulfilling some sort of enjoyment for them.
You feel sorry you did this to your mom?
In a way, yes, but I wouldn't take back what I did. It's strange, really. I did love her. In a way.
Being mean to me?
Oh, no, she's been the best mother.
Kevin Davis says a kind of love. And this, again, speaks to a psychopath's ability to identify that their emotions are not the same as others. It just shows how unbelievably warped his experience of emotion is.
My mother. She said my sister's going to come pick me up now, like in a few minutes.
Okay. What's your sister's name?
Desiree.
Was it a fantasy of yours to kill her as well?
It
and
was.
Did you write down that on your note?
Oh, I did, actually, but I decided against it because, well, I'd had my fill of killing. I didn't seem a little much.
Mm-hmm.
A little too excessive, yeah.
Is she okay?
She is okay, yeah.
Okay. We need to find your sister, just to make sure that she's okay. You said you didn't hurt her, right?
I did not.
We're trying to call her on the phone. We can get her.
The detectives, they're worried that he's lying. However, he's shown absolutely no signs of deception whatsoever. He has not lied about anything else up until that point.
Yes.
I thought it was familiar.
Desiree, it's Sergeant Garcia, Mr. Speedy. Please call me at this number that I'm calling you on. Talk to you. Mr. Foster. Where could she be at now, Michael?
Probably sleeping since last I checked. She works late.
Do you remember what the note said?
Keep your head. Hurry. She might still be alive, although I highly doubt it in parentheses.
Are you just messing with Desiree by writing that she might still be alive?
And my sick sense of humor,
Okay.
I was pretty well off my rocker by then.
She may yet live, although I doubt it. Hurry, Desiree. Sincerely, your brother. He says sincerely, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily write to your own sibling. But then he writes your brother and sort of a ha 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 in your face. This is who did this to our mother.
And those were the scenes where he felt most psychopathic, where he was taunting her, and he was taunting in a deeply cruel way.
Psychopaths generally have a pretty high bar for experiencing fear. So their kind of resting heart rate and their resting physiological response is much lower than the average person. To experience any sort of fear or kind of arousal or what we would call kind of an adrenaline rush, it needs to be amplified to such a degree that the average person would be absolutely terrified by the experience. But the psychopath needs that amount to feel any level of arousal whatsoever. So let's say the average person would get an adrenaline rush or feel afraid by watching a scary movie or going on a roller coaster. These kind of normal experiences would not really elicit a reaction from a psychopath, which is why they tend to do very extreme things in order to feel anything. They feel like they're controlling the person in some way, manipulating them, then it gets fun for them, and then they have an emotional experience. And then that unfortunately creates a cycle because they enjoy that, and so they manipulate more, and they manipulate more, and then they need to go further in order to experience that emotion. Again, similar to a drug addict, you need more and more each time. So the manipulation becomes deeper and deeper and deeper until eventually they're doing something pretty horrific.
You appear to be a nice guy. You appear to be a good guy. You're not yelling and screaming at
You seem
him.
very rational.
You're very rational. You appear to be a good guy. Just sort of trying to figure you out, that's all.
Well, despite how I ended her life, I'm kind of more fascinated by the more artistic ways of murder, the meticulous manner, the way they cut them open, just slice them to pieces. I mean, such care, such love.
It's completely counterintuitive to the emotion of love. But for him, the thought and care that he and potentially other murderers might put into these killings, that to him is the expression of love. It's clear from this video that he's done some research. He looks up to probably other murderers, people who have done things like this.
And then there's a second note in your mom's bedroom. What did that one say? Do you remember?
Chase me.
Was that addressed to the police or to who?
I was in a very playful mood at the time. Initially, my plan was just to run as far as I can, but then I ended up crying my eyes out in like the thick woods, like, what did I do? I knew that my life wasn't going to go anywhere, not anymore.
He may, in fact, have cried his eyes out. This is someone who potentially has never cried before. That's an intense emotion. This is the first time he's really been able to fulfill this fantasy and experience any sort of intense emotion. And that may have been overwhelming for him, not in a negative or positive way, not because he regretted it or felt shame for it, but it was just a release.
Psychopaths don't know what it's like to be alive because what makes us feel alive, it's emotions and connection. They don't feel much and they cannot connect. And so perhaps it was one of the first times that he had such a strong, exhilarating sort of sensation. He felt alive and he wanted to stay there.
I just went over there to their house to use their phone, and then I was using their phone, so I thought I might as well tell them when they asked me questions. I mean, they had questions on using their phone.
Hold on, he's going to talk to you.
Hello?
What's going on, sir? You said that you killed her. What happened?
Well, I killed her. I guess it'll all come out in court.
But I'm saying, what, did you shoot her? Did you stab her? Or what?
I bludgeoned her with a hammer.
Okay, sir, we're going to get somebody over there to you, okay?
Okay, bye.
I'm going to use a dirty word, okay, but I don't mean to insult you, okay? Do you consider you mentally disturbed? Do you consider yourself crazy? Or you think you're okay? You just got some bad thoughts?
I mean, I'm sane. I know exactly what I did. I know that it's wrong in the traditional sense of wrong. I don't have standards or morals. Body's a body, and in the end, piece of meat. I guess it's harsh to say, but now I feel vaguely, kind of like I'm done.
If he was not apprehended, he would have geared up and done it again, potentially to his sister or somebody else. But when he says, I'm done, I think he's referring to this very specific murder and not necessarily his inclination for murder.
Do you still feel like, well, you're done with your mom. Do you still feel like you want to keep on killing?
I came here to pay for my crime, so I guess I should continue with the truth. Truthfully,
Yes, definitely.
I would kill again. It's all for me. I'll say the music, whatever happens, happens. There's not a happy ending for me yet.
Well, just tell me, what do you think should happen to you? What do you think the punishment should be?
Whatever the judge, the people, jury deems fit. I can rot, I can suffer for years, or I can give them the death penalty, whatever they think is for me.
The medical examiner confirmed today that the victim's injuries were consistent with every part of Davis's story.
There was about 18 lacerations about the head, scattered about the surface of the head.
State police say the bodies of 3 women were found at the Black Bear Inn in Newry. They appear to have been shot to death.
This is a particularly gruesome, unusual type of crime.
Police say 31-year-old Christian Nielsen is their only suspect.
We are rolling.
And I parked right before this little church.
So you parked here.
Parked here. I had the gun in my waistband.
Did you see the gun?
Did he see the gun?
Yeah.
No.
You had planned it, but Jim had no idea.
Jim had no idea. You know, I said maybe we should go fishing. I took him out. I was thinking I'm gonna kill this guy.
Did you do it because you're evil?
Evil?
Did you do that just because you're an evil person at the core?
No, I'm a good person.
All right. What I'd like to do is to ask you what happened. You start from the beginning, whatever you think the beginning is.
Okay. We're talking about dead people, right? Is that something you want me to talk about?
So then where do you go?
We go this way.
At this point, are you having any second thoughts?
No, at this point I'm committed.
And Jim is not sensing he's in any danger.
I guess not. Jimmy sat right about there.
Did you say anything to him beforehand then?
I said I have to go to the bathroom. You know, I kind of stood up and said, I gotta go to the bathroom, you know?
Yeah.
And he said, no, you know, I'm not sure what he said. Something.
So you didn't give him any warning what was about to happen?
No, of course not. I bummed a cigarette from him, and when he was just about done with his cigarette, I stood up, and I turned around, and I walked behind him, and I shot him.
From a psych standpoint, I look for whether or not we have psychomotor agitation. Sort of, is he restless? Is he fidgeting? Is he uncomfortable? But it gives us a sign that there's more going on in his head than what he's saying. But he doesn't appear that way. From his body language and the way he's describing his action, he's indifferent to actually the content of what he's talking about.
Did you have some kind of an argument or disagreement with Jim about something?
No. Why do you think, Chris, that you decided that you wanted to shoot Jim?
I don't know. I just objected to his presence.
I don't think that this was necessarily about Jim. This was something he was going to do regardless.
You understand if someone wants to kill you because they hate you, but you have no meaning, ultimately, to a psychopath. It's like an object. You're no different than a coffee cup or than that table. So it's absolutely impersonal. But I think that's what's so scary about it.
And his body went like that, and I shot him again just to make sure, but he was dead. And then, like I said, he had a big torso, but little legs, very tiny legs.
Jim, Christian's first victim, suffered from polio, which is why he describes him as having the legs of a child. Christian could have seen Jim as sort of prime prey. He would have been easy to chase or to sort of hunt down, so it was kind of a good gateway into murder.
And so it was no problem to grab his legs and drag him. Oh, I'm sorry. Drag him this way. So I'm dragging him right now.
Hold on. Okay. Oh, thanks.
He's keeping the branches, from striking her, which seems like an act of kindness. It's what I would call something that is dutiful. I think that's probably the underpinning of superficial charm. They actually don't have the feeling they're trying to demonstrate, but since they don't have the genuine emotion that should go with it, that's what gives the term superficial, right?
Stopped like right about here. There's blood probably. If you look, I'm sure tomorrow you'll see blood here somewhere.
Okay.
Back. Maybe back a bit, but there's blood all through here. There's blood all in that trail. At that point, I was just like, whew. Yeah, so I put the gun back in my waist. And maybe I shot him again, I'm not sure. And then I said, I gotta go to work, and I went to work. I walked back up and...
You left him here.
Left him here. I started digging. My intentions were to dig a grave, but it would have been shallow.
So you first got out here, took your shovel out and started digging here?
These dimensions right here, you can see where I started digging.
Yeah.
He actually laughs. You can hear him kind of doing this sing-song, almost laughing voice.
I just felt that it was the right thing to do.
You didn't want to leave him out in the open?
Didn't want to leave him out in the open.
Why?
He was a dead person. You do something with dead people, you bury them or something, or burn them, right?
She's pushing for a more subtle understanding of, well, what were you feeling? And it seems to throw him for a loop. She is pushing for his feelings, and he doesn't really have them.
So anyway, for whatever reason, I'm out here digging a grave. It wasn't really a grave as in like, gee, I feel bad for Jim, but a grave as in, let's get him in the ground before he starts to smell.
Terry, is there anything else?
I think we're good.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome, Jim.
At first, sometimes you don't know you're talking to a psychopath. Then little things begin to dawn on you as you're having a conversation with them. There's often a sense that their emotions are quite shallow. You feel like you're getting a very superficial answer back from them, that you haven't really met the person. They've given you very nice answers, they're appropriate answers, but you can walk away thinking, I don't know that person. Something feels really off. It can feel slightly irritating, although they can be charming. But you feel like you haven't been able to really communicate with that person. They're not really talking to you.
your philosophy?
Some people die.
Was your goal here to become a serial killer?
I thought that would be enough. I hadn't planned on killing Julie until that night at work, and then I decided to kill her. I mean, it wasn't going to be long before she realized Jimmy wasn't around. You know what I mean? Okay, so I woke up that morning, and I knew I wanted to kill her. Dude, she sleeps until noon. I didn't have that long to wait, man. You know what I'm saying? I felt that I had to get it done quickly. You know, you make a decision like that, you know you got to do it, and you just do it.
Psychopaths do have lower impulse control. Their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in most psychopaths is smaller than the average person, and this is diminished in a psychopath. Christian did not have great impulse control. I think he enjoyed killing Jim, and he wanted to do it again, so he did.
So I got my gun, and I walked around to the window. It was loud. I was opening up the window because I had to move the screen. And then I was like scared because her face was right there. Like the window was here and her face was there. So if she even opened her eyes, she would have seen me. Got my gun, kicked the door didn't budge, and I put it in my shoulder like that, and the door popped off, the lock, door slams open. Julie sits up, she says, no, she said, what the? She's from down south, she just goes, what the hell? I think I shot her once, and she said, oh. And I shot her again and again. And it blew her out of the bed into the wall. That was amazing. So I cut her in half, drug her out in the woods, wrapped her up in a tarp and left her. And I think I went to work.
He was doing cook line work and probably didn't attract anyone's attention as someone who was bizarre or scary or intimidating. And he doesn't apparently engage in odd or peculiar weird behaviors. He would look like an everyday individual who's smart.
Why did you want to use guns?
Because that's what you used to kill people with. I thought that'd be the quickest, most humane way to do it.
Humane.
Yeah.
Julie kids are going to ask us why. What do I tell Julie's kids? Julie was a horrible person and she deserved it. So why are you laughing?
I'm sorry, I felt like I'm tired.
I'm not trying to be funny. I'm
I know
trying
you're not. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I don't care what you tell Julie's kids.
This is an illogical thing to ask him in his mind. Why are you even asking me this? Why should I possibly care? Psychopaths generally will not experience these emotions.
They're asking you about Julie. Where's Julie? I know I'm gonna kill her. Somebody's gonna die.
Okay, so what time would you get out Sunday night?
Same time. 10. Came home, went to bed.
Okay.
This morning I woke up. Ate breakfast. Cleaned. I shot her old dog because the dog was 12, 13 years old. I mean, it was way too old for a dog.
Shot the dog?
Yeah, I shot the dog. I felt bad about that.
I don't believe that Christian felt bad about killing the dog. One hallmark that we do often see in psychopaths is an early abuse of animals. It's in some ways a practice for what they're eventually going to do because they're less likely to get caught for it, because the animal's not going to tell anybody or say anything. And so animals are often kind of the gateway into some sort of aggression or violence towards a person.
Saw your friend come up from the driveway to the front door. I see them. They're chit-chatting away, blah, blah, blah. Saw your friend come up. I'm going to grab my 38, put it in my waist. And of course, they're asking me about Julie the whole time. Where's Julie? What's up with Julie? What's wrong with Julie? I don't know what to say. You know, I know I'm gonna kill her, basically.
Christian killing Selby essentially was orphaning her children. Her husband had died and she had 2 children at home. So by killing her, those children now have no parents. They also have no grandmother because he had already killed her. But he doesn't care.
I'm in the office with a friend. The friend's talking to me. I met you once before. I've stayed behind the friend. And we hear Selby go in the bedroom and Selby starts talking. And the friend says, "Oh, please go ahead." I said, "I want to go after you." So the friend walks into the bedroom. Selby says, "Christian, did you kill my mother?" I don't know apropos of what. Like, I don't know how Selby managed to pick up that many clues because I wiped up most of the blood, cleaning most of the blood. The door is busted. I think that's what gave it away. She saw the busted door and she was like, I don't know if she was joking or what, but she said, "Christian, did you kill my mother?" And right before she said that, or right as she was saying that, I shot her friend in the back of the head. I shot her in the head. They both went down real quick.
Did you feel like, or do you feel now that killing Jim and Julie and Selby and her friend, do you feel like that was wrong?
Well, I think I went about it badly, but I'd never done it before.
When you look at the transcripts or the speech patterns of people who have psychopathy, they don't use metaphor very often. They're very concrete, very direct, and they're somewhat confused when people push for the meaning of feelings and nuance, and they seem to be perplexed. To him, it makes no sense. It is like speaking a totally different language.
Well, I don't mean how you did it. I mean, do you think it's wrong that they're dead now?
Well, they weren't dead before, and now they're dead. So.
Do you think it's a bad thing that you did?
It doesn't make any difference. It's done. They're dead. I'm alive.
And he goes, I'm not really into those moral debates, those debates about morality. It's not really my thing. It just is what it is. So there is a perception that the rest of us are caught up in a system of rules, regulations, and things that should guide our behavior. And they are separate from it, observing it as this interesting, curious system that other people adhere to, but that does not apply to them at all times. The ones I've evaluated, and I think in these particular cases, it seems to me their view is, no, the rule's just wrong. I mean, the rule, they're indifferent to the rule. The rule makes no sense to them. If what they're going to do is in line with their fantasy or their vision, the rule has no relevance.
When your dad showed up today, you didn't kill your dad. How come?
Because my dad.
What'd you tell your dad
About what?
about what happened?
Nothing. Really.
What was your dad's reaction?
He didn't think it was awesome or anything.
He's again almost frustrated that she doesn't understand his logic. Like, how could you ask me that? Why would I kill him? He's my dad. Why wouldn't he kill him? He killed 4 other people in the last 48 hours. He assumes that the other people are gonna kind of follow his logic and follow his line of thinking, when in fact, his line of thinking is completely deviant.
Police say 31-year-old Christian Nielsen confessed to these killings, and he's charged with 4 counts of murder.
You did us wrong. There was no sense in doing what he did. And then can't explain yourself? No. I'm sorry.
I do want to avoid a trial, simply because the outcome would be guilty.
But I wish he was dead.
Those who know Christian Nielsen describe him as a bit odd, quiet, and hardworking.
I heard the news this morning, and I was like, is that the same Christian that I went to school with?
Nielsen had been working as a cook at the Sudbury Inn just down the road from the murder scene, where he had also been living.
You know, in many of the pictures, he looks directly at the camera and smiles.
He is smirking because he's amused at the degree to which everyone is fascinated about this whole thing in the first place. I think he's the outside observer saying, huh, look at all these crazy humans. He's amused and fascinated by these strange people in this strange world who seem to be all stirred up about what he did.
Like, I could deny that I killed all those people.
Why didn't you?
I just didn't. Here we are.
It should give you a hint when you hear warning signs. If you think you've bumped into someone who might be a psychopath, there are some ways in which you begin to feel unnerved by little comments and little things. And I suspect Julie probably knew that in the B&B from one of the comments he makes. But when you're not getting that reciprocity of empathy and that conversation is moving in a different direction, you may be speaking to someone who just doesn't get emotion. Can you stop being a psychopath? Early on, if it's a kid, very young, some of the evidence from psychotherapy data says if they're really young, you may be able to shape and get people's behavior to change. I tend to be more cynical about it than some of my colleagues, but some people would disagree if they say they can change. In my experience, I don't think they do.
Okay. So, you told me what happened, but you haven't told me why.
I just did it. I can see it coming.
How long? For how long did you see it coming?
Time I was 13 to 26.
That's all you thought about.
Yeah.
Would there have been more?
Yeah.
Why?
That's what I do.
Jerome Henry Brito's looked like the kind of man no one would remember. In the late 1960s, he lived in Salem, Oregon, worked as an electrician, was married, and was raising 2 children. To his neighbors, he appeared quiet, dependable, and unremarkable. He left for work, returned home, maintained his property, and blended effortlessly into the rhythm of suburban life. There were no obvious signs that behind the walls of his home existed a secret world built upon obsession, control, and violence. Yet while families locked their doors each evening believing they lived in one of Oregon's safer communities, a predator was already searching for his next victim. Between January 1968 and April 1969, 4 young women disappeared after crossing paths with Jerry Brudos. Their disappearances seemed isolated at first, separated by months and linked by little more than tragedy. Investigators had no reason to believe they were witnessing the work of a single offender. But as evidence slowly emerged, the horrifying reality became impossible to ignore. Beneath the surface of an ordinary life was a man driven by fantasies that had grown darker for decades, eventually erupting into a series of murders that would earn him 2 chilling names in American criminal history: the Lust Killer and the Shoe Fetish Slayer. These nicknames were never meant to sensationalize the crimes. Instead, they reflected a disturbing truth uncovered during the investigation: that Bruto's motivation was neither financial gain nor personal revenge. His crimes were rooted in deeply entrenched sexual obsessions and an overwhelming desire to dominate and possess his victims. Understanding this distinction would later make his case one of the most significant studies in criminal behavioral analysis for investigators, psychologists, and FBI profilers. Jerry Bruttos represented an example of what would become known as a lust murderer, someone whose crimes were driven primarily by violent fantasies rather than practical motives. But before he became the subject of academic research and law enforcement training, there were 4 young women whose lives were violently interrupted. Linda Slauson was only 19 years old, working as a door-to-door saleswoman with hopes and responsibilities typical of countless young adults trying to establish their futures. Jan Susan Whitney was 23 when a routine roadside problem unexpectedly placed her in the path of a killer. Karen Sprinker, just 18, was studying chemistry, standing at the beginning of what promised to be a bright academic journey. Linda Sally, 22 years old, never imagined that stopping to answer what appeared to be a simple request for directions would become the final decision of her life. Each of these women had families who waited for them to return home. Each disappearance began not with violence, but with ordinary moments that seemed entirely routine. A workday, a shopping trip, a drive along familiar roads. The frightening reality of serial murder is often hidden inside these ordinary moments. There is rarely a dramatic warning. No music announces danger. No visible sign separates a killer from every other face encountered throughout the day. That truth made Jerry Bruttos especially dangerous. Unlike criminals driven by impulse or public displays of aggression, he had learned to disguise himself within society. He maintained employment. He supported a family. He spoke politely when necessary. Those around him saw a husband and a father. They did not see the fantasies he concealed or the private rituals that occupied his thoughts. They certainly did not know that inside his own garage, a hidden room existed that even his wife was forbidden to enter. Years later, investigators would search that room and uncover evidence that transformed scattered disappearances into one of Oregon's most disturbing murder investigations. Shoes collected over many years, women's clothing, camera equipment, restraints, personal belongings connected to missing victims. Photographs documenting the hidden life Bruttos had spent years protecting. Every item discovered inside that garage would reveal another layer of a personality divided between outward normality and private violence. Yet none of those discoveries happened immediately. When the first young woman disappeared in January 1968, investigators possessed almost nothing to connect her disappearance to anyone in particular. Missing persons cases were notoriously difficult. Adults disappeared for many reasons. Some left voluntarily. Others encountered accidents. Without witnesses, physical evidence, or obvious crime scenes, detectives were forced to consider countless possibilities. There was little reason to imagine that the disappearance marked the beginning of a 16-month killing spree. After the first murder came months of silence. No additional confirmed killings occurred for nearly a year. To investigators, this gap made it even harder to recognize a pattern. Today, behavioral experts refer to such intervals as cooling-off periods, pauses during which some serial offenders temporarily stop killing while their violent fantasies continue to develop. In Bruttos' case, later psychological analysis suggested that although the murders paused, his obsessions did not. The fantasies remained alive beneath the surface, waiting until they escalated once again into violence. When another young woman vanished under entirely different circumstances, investigators still struggled to connect the cases. Different locations, different victims, different situations. Only much later would witness statements, physical evidence, and Bruttos' own confession reveal that the crimes were linked by a single offender whose methods adapted while his underlying motivation remained constant. Looking back, the warning signs stretched much further into the past than anyone realized at the time. Long before he committed murder, Jerry Bruttos had already demonstrated deeply troubling behavior. As a child, he became fixated on women's shoes after discovering a pair of high heels. What began as fascination gradually developed into compulsive theft. During adolescence, he secretly collected women's shoes, stole lingerie, and combined these objects with increasingly disturbing fantasies. His behavior escalated beyond theft. Before becoming a murderer, Brudos attacked women, sometimes using violence simply to steal their shoes. On one occasion, he threatened a young woman with a knife during such an assault. Following that incident, he was committed to a psychiatric hospital for approximately 9 months, where doctors diagnosed serious personality problems and recommended continued treatment. But treatment alone proved insufficient. After his release, Brudos returned to society, completed school, found employment, married, and built what appeared to be a conventional life. To those who knew him casually, it may have seemed that whatever troubled him during adolescence had been left behind. In reality, according to his later statements and the evidence uncovered after his arrest, the violent fantasies had never disappeared. They had simply become hidden behind the routines of adulthood. This contrast between appearance and reality remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Jerry Brudos did not fit the image many people imagine when thinking about violent criminals. He was not constantly in conflict with neighbors. He was not publicly unstable. Instead, he carefully separated his public identity from his private compulsions. That separation allowed him to avoid suspicion while his behavior became increasingly dangerous. His story would ultimately force investigators and behavioral scientists to reconsider many assumptions about how serial offenders lived among ordinary communities. It also reinforced an uncomfortable truth that continues to shape criminal investigations today. Appearances alone rarely reveal the capacity for violence. To understand how an apparently ordinary electrician became one of Oregon's most infamous serial killers, it is necessary to return to the beginning, to a childhood marked by rejection, an obsession that started with a discarded pair of women's shoes, and a series of warning signs that, while recognized individually, were never fully understood until it was far too late. In the next chapter, we travel back to Webster, South Dakota, where the earliest chapters of Jerry Brudos' life reveal how an unusual childhood fixation gradually evolved into a dangerous pattern of behavior that would eventually culminate in one of the most disturbing murder cases in American criminal history. Long before the name Jerry Brudos became associated with one of Oregon's most disturbing murder investigations, he was simply Jerome Henry Brudos, a boy born on January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota. Looking back after his arrest, psychiatrists, investigators, and behavioral experts searched his early life for clues that might explain how an apparently ordinary child would eventually become a serial murderer driven by violent sexual obsessions. They were careful not to suggest that childhood alone determined his future. Countless people endured difficult family relationships without becoming violent offenders. Yet in Brudos' case, the documented facts reveal a series of troubling experiences and behaviors that, when viewed together, formed the foundation of a deeply disturbed psychological pattern. According to later psychiatric reports, one of the earliest influences centered on his relationship with his mother. Family dynamics are often complicated, and historical accounts must be treated cautiously. But multiple evaluations completed after Brudos' arrest consistently described a household in which he believed he was unwanted from the very beginning. His mother had hoped to give birth to a daughter. Instead, she had another son, and Brudos later claimed that her disappointment never truly disappeared. Investigators and mental health professionals noted repeated descriptions of emotional rejection and criticism throughout his childhood. Whether every memory reflected objective reality or his own later interpretation, those perceptions became an important part of his psychological history. Children develop their understanding of themselves largely through the people closest to them. Encouragement, affection, and stability can build confidence, while persistent rejection may contribute to emotional difficulties. In Bruto's case, psychiatrists believe that his sense of isolation and resentment developed early, although they emphasized that such experiences alone could never explain or excuse the crimes he would later commit. The responsibility for those crimes remained entirely his own. One event in particular would become almost inseparable from discussions of his case. Around the age of 5, Brutos reportedly discovered a pair of women's high-heeled shoes discarded in a trash bin. To most children, such an object would have meant little. For Brutos, however, it became the beginning of an obsession that would dominate the rest of his life. He later described being fascinated by the shoes, repeatedly returning to them and experiencing emotions he could neither understand nor control. Over time, the fascination intensified rather than fading. What began as curiosity gradually evolved into a compulsive fixation. As he entered childhood and then adolescence, Brutos sought out more women's shoes whenever possible. He searched through garbage containers looking for discarded pairs. He stole shoes whenever opportunities presented themselves. He hid them away from family members, creating secret collections that continued to grow. According to the psychiatric evaluations presented after his arrest, he often wore the shoes in private, combining them with increasingly elaborate fantasies. Eventually, the obsession expanded beyond footwear alone. Women's lingerie and feet also became central elements of his fantasies. Specialists later identified these behaviors as examples of severe fetishism that had developed unusually early and intensified throughout adolescence. More importantly, they observed that the obsession was no longer limited to objects themselves. Increasingly, Brutos associated those objects with fantasies involving power, domination, and control over women. This progression deeply concerned the professionals who evaluated him because it suggested that the fantasies were becoming more dangerous with age rather than diminishing. By his teenage years, the obsession had already begun affecting his behavior outside the privacy of his room. Instead of limiting himself to collecting discarded shoes, Brutos started stealing directly from homes. He reportedly broke into residences specifically to obtain women's shoes. The thefts were not motivated by financial gain. The shoes themselves represented the reward. Investigators later discovered that he had accumulated numerous pairs over the years, carefully hiding them from others. Yet even these thefts eventually became insufficient. The fantasies continued escalating, demanding more direct interaction with potential victims. Around the age of 17, Brutos committed an assault that demonstrated just how far his behavior had progressed. According to the records referenced after his arrest, he climbed into the vehicle of a young woman and threatened her with a knife, forcing her to surrender her shoes. The attack was not carried out for robbery in the conventional sense. Money and valuables held little interest for him. His objective was entirely focused on obtaining the shoes. Although the victim survived, the incident represented a significant escalation from secret theft to direct confrontation. It was one of the earliest documented occasions in which his obsession translated into violence. Against another person, authorities recognized that Brutos required psychiatric intervention. Following the assault, he was committed to a psychiatric hospital for approximately 9 months. During that period, doctors evaluated his behavior extensively. They diagnosed serious personality disturbances and recommended continued treatment after his release. Their findings suggested that his psychological problems were severe and unlikely to disappear without long-term care. Unfortunately, despite the intervention, the underlying obsessions remained. The available records indicate that treatment did not eliminate the fantasies that had developed over so many years. Instead, Brutos eventually returned to society, carrying those same compulsions beneath a more controlled exterior. After leaving the hospital, he appeared determined to build a conventional life. He completed high school, learned electrical work, and established a career as an electrician. In 1961, he married. Eventually, he and his wife had 2 children. To neighbors and co-workers, these developments seemed to represent stability and maturity. The troubled teenager appeared to have become a responsible adult. Many people who encountered him during these years later described him using similar words: quiet, hardworking, polite, dependable. There was nothing about his public behavior that immediately suggested he posed an extraordinary danger. Yet according to Brutto's own later statements, the fantasies that had troubled him since childhood never truly disappeared. Instead, he concealed them more effectively. Rather than abandoning his obsessions, he simply separated them from his public identity. This division between outward normality and hidden compulsion became one of the defining characteristics of his life. By all appearances, he was succeeding as a husband, father, and skilled tradesman. Privately, however, he continued nurturing the same disturbing interests that had begun decades earlier. During these years, another alarming behavior emerged. Before committing the murders for which he would later become infamous, Brutto's attacked women on multiple occasions for the purpose of stealing their shoes. According to the information documented after his arrest, he sometimes stalked women walking alone before assaulting or choking them long enough to take the footwear that had attracted his attention. These attacks demonstrated that physical violence had become increasingly integrated into his obsession. The victims themselves were no longer simply associated with the objects he desired. They had become obstacles to be overcome in order to satisfy his fantasies. One particularly disturbing incident revealed how dramatically those fantasies had evolved. At one point before the murders, Brutto's dug a pit in the ground with the apparent intention of imprisoning a woman as a sexual captive. The plan was never carried out, but investigators later viewed the act itself as an important indication of his psychological state. It showed that his fantasies extended far beyond theft or assault. They now involved prolonged domination and complete control over another human being. This escalation reflected a dangerous progression that would later characterize many aspects of his criminal behavior. Looking back, the warning signs appear strikingly clear. There were repeated thefts, assaults motivated by highly unusual obsessions, psychiatric hospitalization, persistent violent fantasies, and evidence of increasingly elaborate plans involving potential victims. Yet during the 1950s and early 1960s, criminal behavioral science remained in its infancy. The concept of serial murder had not yet been systematically studied. Behavioral profiling did not exist in the sophisticated form later developed by the FBI. Individual incidents were often viewed in isolation rather than as components of an escalating pattern. As a result, Brutto's was able to continue living within the community without attracting sustained law enforcement attention. By the early 1960s, he had successfully constructed two completely different identities. One belonged to the world everyone could see, an electrician supporting his family, a quiet neighbor living in Salem, Oregon, and an apparently ordinary citizen. The other existed entirely behind closed doors, hidden from friends, co-workers, and even much of his own family. It was a private world increasingly dominated by secret collections, obsessive fantasies, and growing desires for power and control. Those two identities would coexist for years, but they could not remain separate forever. As the decade progressed, the fantasies that had shaped Jerry Brutto since childhood continued intensifying. Eventually, according to the evidence later uncovered by investigators, theft and assault were no longer enough to satisfy the compulsions that had governed his life for decades. The next stage of that progression would unfold inside the home, where he appeared to be living the life of an ordinary family man. A home that concealed a hidden garage room, carefully kept off limits even to his wife, where obsession would ultimately evolve into murder. By the beginning of 1968, Jerry Brutto had spent years constructing a life that appeared stable from the outside. He had a steady job as an electrician, a wife, and 2 children. To the people who lived nearby in Salem, Oregon, he seemed like an ordinary working man whose routine rarely changed. Neighbors later described him as quiet, reserved, and hardworking. Nothing about his public image suggested that investigators would one day search his property and uncover evidence connected to multiple murders. The contrast between appearance and reality became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Brudos had learned to keep his private world almost completely separate from his public life, allowing him to avoid suspicion while his obsessions continued to grow. Central to that hidden world was a section of his garage that no one else was permitted to enter. According to the investigation, Brudos created a private area that even his wife was forbidden from accessing. The restriction may not have seemed unusual to outsiders at the time. Many homeowners maintained workshops or personal spaces where tools and projects were stored. There was no obvious reason for neighbors or visitors to question why part of the garage remained off-limits. Only after Brudos' arrest would investigators discover the significance of that hidden room. Inside, they found hundreds of women's shoes, numerous pieces of women's clothing, camera equipment, restraints, and items later connected to missing victims. The room represented years of carefully concealed obsession, preserving evidence that reflected the progression documented throughout his life. Looking backward, investigators recognized that the warning signs had never truly disappeared after his release from psychiatric care. Instead, they had evolved. As a teenager, Brudos had stolen shoes and assaulted women to obtain them. As an adult, according to the evidence presented after his arrest, his fantasies became increasingly centered on complete control over victims rather than simply acquiring personal belongings. Behavioral experts later described this progression as an escalation, in which earlier criminal acts gradually became insufficient to satisfy the offender's psychological needs. Importantly, this did not happen overnight. The transformation unfolded over many years, hidden behind the routines of employment, marriage, and family life. During this period, Brudos continued functioning well enough to maintain his career and outward responsibilities. That ability to compartmentalize his life made him especially difficult to identify before the murders began. Nothing in his daily routine immediately separated him from thousands of other men living in Oregon. During the late 1960s, for investigators, this presented a difficult lesson that would later influence criminal profiling. Some offenders are capable of presenting an entirely ordinary appearance while privately nurturing increasingly dangerous fantasies. It is precisely because of that hidden nature that serial murder investigations often become so complex. Without physical evidence or surviving witnesses, law enforcement must work against an offender who understands the value of secrecy. On January 26, 1968, that secrecy began to produce irreversible consequences. 19-year-old Linda Slauson was working as a door-to-door saleswoman. Like many young people starting their adult lives, her work required visiting unfamiliar neighborhoods and speaking with strangers. Selling products from house to house depended upon trust. Every knock on a front door carried the expectation that the resident might become a customer rather than a threat. It was an ordinary workday, one built around routine conversations and brief encounters with homeowners. According to the evidence later established during the investigation, Linda eventually arrived at Jerry Brudos' residence. Brudos appeared interested in the products she was selling and invited her inside. From Linda's perspective, there was little reason to view the invitation as unusual. Sales representatives regularly entered homes when demonstrating products to prospective buyers. It was a common part of the job, repeated countless times every day across the country. Tragically, this routine interaction became the final confirmed sighting of Linda Slauson alive. According to Brudos' later confession and the investigative findings, he attacked her inside the house, strangled her, and concealed her body. At the time of her disappearance, however, investigators possessed none of that information. They knew only that a 19-year-old woman had vanished while working. Her family reported her missing, hoping that she had encountered an unexpected delay or experienced some form of accident. As the hours turned into days, concerns steadily grew. Missing person investigations often begin with uncertainty because adults sometimes disappear, voluntarily or for reasons unrelated to crime, without witnesses placing Linda inside Brutto's home or physical evidence pointing toward a suspect. Detectives were forced to explore numerous possibilities. They interviewed acquaintances, retraced her known movements, and searched for information that might explain her disappearance. Despite those efforts, the investigation quickly reached a dead end. There was no immediate suspect, no obvious crime scene, no clear explanation for what had happened after she visited the neighborhood that day. Linda's disappearance remained an unresolved mystery. Her family was left waiting for answers that would not come for many months. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of cases like Linda's is the uncertainty experienced by those left behind. Families often live between hope and fear, unable to determine whether to expect a reunion or prepare for unimaginable loss. Every unanswered telephone call, every reported sighting, and every rumor carries emotional weight. Investigators continue searching while relatives struggle with questions that have no immediate answers. In Linda Slauson's case, those answers would remain hidden until after Jerry Brutto's eventual arrest. Her body was identified only because Brutto's later revealed information known only to the perpetrator. At the time, however, investigators could not have known that her disappearance marked the beginning of a series of murders rather than an isolated event. Following Linda's murder, something unexpected happened. The killings stopped. For nearly a year, there were no additional confirmed victims linked to Brutto's. From the perspective of law enforcement, this prolonged silence made identifying a serial offender almost impossible. A single unexplained disappearance, while deeply concerning, did not automatically suggest the existence of a repeat killer. Without additional similar cases, detectives had little basis for recognizing a broader pattern. Years later, behavioral specialists examining the case described this period as a cooling-off phase. During such intervals, a serial offender may temporarily cease killing while continuing to experience the fantasies and compulsions that drive the violence. In Brutto's case, investigators later concluded that although no additional confirmed murders occurred during this period, his underlying obsessions remained active. According to the available evidence, he continued maintaining the hidden garage room and the private collections that reflected his long-standing fixation. The absence of murder did not mean the disappearance of dangerous thoughts. Instead, those thoughts continued to develop beyond public view. This nearly year-long pause also contributed to the sense of security within the community. Without another disappearance immediately following Linda's case, there was little reason for residents to believe a serial predator was operating in Salem. Life continued as normal. Families went to work, students attended school, and young women carried out everyday activities without knowing that the man responsible for Linda Slauson's disappearance remained free. The investigation itself gradually lost momentum as detectives exhausted available leads. Cases without witnesses or recoverable evidence often become increasingly difficult as time passes. Memories fade, potential clues disappear, and the likelihood of solving the crime diminishes. Yet unknown to investigators, the story was far from over. The silence that followed Linda Slauson's disappearance was not the end of Jerry Brutto's violence. It was only an interruption. Before the year was over, another ordinary day would place a second young woman in his path. In this time, a surviving witness would unknowingly provide details that would later become one of the first meaningful threads connecting an apparently random disappearance to the quiet electrician living behind an ordinary suburban door. Nearly 10 months passed after Linda Slauson disappeared. For investigators, the absence of another similar case made it increasingly difficult to determine whether her disappearance had been the result of foul play or an isolated tragedy with no identifiable suspect. Leads gradually faded. Interviews were revisited, neighborhoods were searched, and every reasonable possibility was explored. Yet no evidence emerged that could explain what had happened to the 19-year-old saleswoman. Her family continued living with uncertainty, caught between hope and grief, while the man responsible quietly resumed the routines of everyday life. Jerry Britos continued working as an electrician, returned home to his wife and children, and maintained the appearance of a dependable family man. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. During the day, he blended effortlessly into the community. Privately, according to the evidence uncovered after his arrest, the violent fantasies that had shaped his life since childhood had not disappeared. Instead, they remained hidden beneath a carefully constructed image of normality. Behavioral experts would later describe this period as a cooling-off phase, a temporary pause in outward violence rather than a resolution of the psychological forces driving it. Then, on November 26, 1968, that silence came to an end. 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney was traveling with a friend when an unexpected mechanical problem interrupted their journey. A broken-down vehicle is an inconvenience that countless drivers experience every day. It often leads to accepting assistance from strangers, particularly in an era when roadside communication was far more limited than it is today. For Whitney and her companion, there was little reason to believe that the person offering help represented a deadly threat. According to the investigative record, Jerry Britos stopped and offered assistance. He presented himself as someone capable of repairing the vehicle and examined the problem. After looking at the car, he reportedly explained that additional tools would be necessary to complete the repair. He suggested transporting both women to their destination before returning with Whitney to retrieve the required equipment. On the surface, the proposal appeared practical. It offered a solution to an inconvenient roadside situation, and there was nothing immediately alarming about the calm, cooperative man making the offer. Whitney agreed. It was a decision that countless reasonable people might have made under similar circumstances, relying on the expectation that ordinary acts of kindness between strangers were still possible. According to Britos' later confession, once Whitney accompanied him, she never returned. He took her to his home, where she was murdered before her body was later disposed of in a river. At the time of her disappearance, however, investigators possessed none of that information. What they did have was something they had lacked during Linda Slauson's case: a witness who had interacted directly with the man believed to be the last person to see the victim alive. Whitney's companion became an essential source of information. Although unable to identify Jerry Britos by name, the witness carefully described the encounter. Investigators obtained details about the man's appearance, the type of vehicle he drove, and the sequence of events leading to Whitney leaving with him. Individually, these details did not immediately solve the case. Oregon contained countless vehicles fitting similar descriptions, and without additional physical evidence, identifying one specific driver remained extraordinarily difficult. Nevertheless, those observations were carefully documented and preserved within the investigative files. At the time, detectives could not know how valuable those notes would eventually become. The disappearance of Jan Susan Whitney presented investigators with another troubling mystery. Once again, a young woman had vanished after an apparently ordinary interaction. Once again, there was no obvious crime scene. Once again, there were few immediate clues capable of directing investigators toward a suspect. Yet unlike the first disappearance, detectives now possessed a timeline supported by another person's first-hand observations. Although incomplete, this information represented the first significant thread connecting an unknown man to one of the disappearances. Looking back after Britos' arrest, investigators realized how important that witness had been. The description of both the driver and his vehicle later aligned with other statements collected during the investigation, gradually transforming isolated observations into a recognizable pattern. At the time, however, the similarities between Linda Slauson's disappearance and Whitney's case remained difficult to establish. The victims had disappeared under different circumstances. One was working door to door. The other encountered apparent roadside assistance. Their daily routines, locations, and activities appeared unrelated. Detectives had no confirmed forensic evidence placing the same offender at both scenes. Without such connections, caution required investigators to avoid prematurely concluding that a serial offender was operating. This uncertainty illustrates one of the greatest challenges in serial murder investigations, particularly during the late 1960s. Modern criminal profiling techniques were still in their infancy, and computerized databases capable of rapidly comparing cases across jurisdictions did not yet exist. Detectives relied heavily upon witness interviews, handwritten reports, physical evidence, and patient comparison of investigative files. Even when similarities existed, recognizing them often required considerable time. Meanwhile, Jerry Brito's returned once again to his ordinary routines. Nothing about his public behavior changed sufficiently to attract immediate suspicion. He continued maintaining his employment and fulfilling the outward expectations of family life. To neighbors, there was little indication that anything unusual had occurred. The hidden garage remained concealed from visitors and even from members of his own household. Behind its closed doors, investigators would later discover physical evidence revealing the private world Brutos had spent years constructing. But at the end of 1968, none of that evidence had yet been uncovered. The second disappearance also deepened the suffering experienced by another family searching desperately for answers. Like the relatives of Linda Slauson, Jan Susan Whitney's loved ones were left confronting uncertainty rather than certainty. Missing person cases create a particularly painful form of grief because they deny families a clear understanding of what has happened. Every passing day allows hope to compete with fear. Every unanswered question becomes more difficult to bear. While investigators pursued every available lead, the emotional burden carried by those closest to the victims continued growing. The contrast between those families and Jerry Bruto's could hardly have been greater. One side searched endlessly for loved ones who never returned. The other continued living an apparently uneventful suburban existence, protected by the absence of direct evidence. Yet despite his apparent success in avoiding detection, small cracks had begun to appear in the illusion of anonymity. The witness description obtained during Whitney's disappearance would eventually become one of the most valuable pieces of information in the entire investigation. Alone, it was insufficient. Combined with later evidence, however, it would help investigators narrow their focus toward a man who had spent years believing he could hide behind normality. As winter turned into spring in 1969, the investigation remained unresolved. Detectives continued reviewing reports, preserving witness statements, and searching for new information. Unfortunately, before they could identify the man responsible, Jerry Brutos would kill again. His next victim would be 18-year-old Karen Sprinker, a chemistry student whose disappearance would introduce additional witnesses, reinforce emerging similarities between the cases, and convince investigators that the tragedies unfolding across Oregon were no longer isolated events, but part of a far more disturbing pattern. Soon afterward, another young woman, Linda Sally, would also vanish. Her case would produce the crucial turning point that transformed scattered investigations into a coordinated effort to identify a serial killer. The mistakes Brutos made during these final crimes would gradually unravel the carefully guarded double life he had maintained for years, bringing detectives closer than ever before to the quiet electrician whose hidden obsessions had already claimed for innocent lives. By the spring of 1969, investigators were no longer dealing with a single unexplained disappearance. Although no definitive connection had yet been established, the growing number of young women vanishing under seemingly ordinary circumstances was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Families were searching for daughters who had simply gone about their daily routines and never returned. Detectives continued working each case independently while quietly comparing reports, looking for similarities that might reveal whether the same individual was responsible. Unknown to them, Jerry Brutos had become more confident. He had already escaped accountability for 2 murders, maintained his employment, continued living with his wife and children, and successfully concealed the hidden room inside his garage where evidence of his private obsessions accumulated over the years. To the outside world, he remained an ordinary electrician. Behind that carefully maintained facade, however, his violence had not ended. On March 27, 1969, 18-year-old Karen Sprinker disappeared. Karen was a chemistry student with her future ahead of her, another young woman whose life revolved around the ordinary routines of education, family, and everyday responsibilities. According to the investigative record, she was out shopping when Jerry Brudos encountered her. Unlike the circumstances surrounding Linda Slauson or Jan Susan Whitney, Karen's disappearance occurred in a public setting where people were present nearby. Witnesses later remembered seeing Karen speaking with a man beside a vehicle before she vanished. At the time, the conversation attracted little attention. There was nothing obviously alarming about 2 people speaking in a parking area or along a shopping route. Everyday life is filled with brief interactions between strangers, and few bystanders have reason to suspect they are witnessing the opening moments of a violent crime. Only after Karen failed to return did those observations become significant. During the investigation, witnesses recalled seeing her with an unidentified man, offering detectives another valuable piece of information. Although they could not identify Jerry Brudos at that stage, their recollections reinforced an emerging pattern. Once again, a young woman had last been seen interacting with an unknown male before disappearing completely. According to Brudos' later confession, he forced Karen into his vehicle at gunpoint before taking her away. He admitted that Karen pleaded for her life during the encounter, but despite those pleas, he killed her before disposing of her body in the Long Tom River. Investigators would later verify key aspects of his confession through the recovery of evidence and his ability to provide details that only the perpetrator could have known. For Karen's family, however, none of those facts were available in the days immediately following her disappearance. Like the families before them, they entered a painful period of uncertainty, hoping for information while fearing the worst. Karen's disappearance proved important not only because it added another victim to the growing investigation, but also because detectives finally began recognizing meaningful similarities between multiple cases. As investigators compared available evidence, several common characteristics became increasingly difficult to ignore. The victims were all young women. They disappeared during daylight hours while engaged in ordinary daily activities. There was no indication that robberies served as the motive. Valuable personal property was not the focus of the crimes. In addition, when evidence eventually emerged, the victims were associated with rivers or waterways where their bodies had been concealed. Individually, these similarities might have been explained by coincidence. Collectively, they suggested the possibility of a single offender operating across the region. For detectives, this realization represented a significant turning point. Although they still lacked a suspect, they were beginning to understand that they might be searching for someone following a consistent behavioral pattern rather than investigating unrelated disappearances. This shift in perspective influenced the direction of future investigative efforts. Detectives became increasingly attentive to witness descriptions, reports involving suspicious vehicles, and previous complaints involving assaults against women. The investigation was evolving from isolated casework into the search for a serial predator. Yet before investigators could identify him, Jerry Brudos struck once more. Less than a month after Karen Sprinker's disappearance, another young woman became his final confirmed victim. On April 23, 1969, 22-year-old Linda Sally was driving when she encountered Brudos. According to the investigative findings, he approached her by pretending to need directions. It was a simple request, one that most drivers would not immediately perceive as threatening. Acts of courtesy towards strangers were common, and there was little reason for Linda to suspect that the man seeking assistance intended to harm her. After gaining the opportunity to approach her, Brudos kidnapped Linda. According to his later confession and the evidence gathered during the investigation, she was murdered, and he attempted to conceal the crime by disposing of her body in a river. Learning from previous experiences, Brudos attempted to ensure that the body would remain underwater by attaching it to a heavy automobile transmission before throwing it into the water. His intention was clear: prevent discovery and eliminate one of the most important sources of evidence available to investigators. If the body remained hidden indefinitely, detectives would have even fewer opportunities to reconstruct what had happened. But nature does not always cooperate with carefully planned concealment. Despite the weight attached to the body, Linda Sally's remains eventually resurfaced. Several weeks later, 2 fishermen discovered the body floating in the river. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. For the first time, detectives possessed physical evidence connected to one of the murders rather than relying solely upon missing person reports and witness interviews. Medical examination confirmed that Linda had been the victim of homicide. More importantly, investigators recognized similarities between her case and the previous disappearances. The recovery of her body intensified media attention throughout Oregon. Newspapers and local communities increasingly questioned whether a dangerous offender was targeting young women across the region. Public concern grew rapidly. Families became more cautious. Women traveling alone exercised greater vigilance. Law enforcement agencies recognized that the investigation required additional resources. Linda Sally's case marked the moment when scattered disappearances became a matter of statewide urgency. Detectives from different agencies began coordinating their efforts more closely, sharing information that might previously have remained within individual case files. Witness statements collected months earlier were reviewed once again. Descriptions of suspicious vehicles were compared. Reports involving attempted assaults or unusual encounters with women received renewed attention. Investigators understood that if a serial offender was indeed responsible, identifying him quickly was essential to preventing additional murders. Looking back, Linda Sally's murder represented the beginning of the end for Jerry Brudos' carefully hidden double life. Ironically, the very measures he took to prevent discovery contributed to the investigation that would ultimately expose him. The recovered body drew unprecedented attention to the case and encouraged a broader review of earlier disappearances. Patterns that once appeared uncertain now became increasingly persuasive. Detectives no longer viewed each victim in isolation. Instead, they began assembling pieces of a much larger puzzle. At the same time, another important development strengthened the investigation. During Brudos' period of criminal activity, at least 2 women survived attempted abductions. One of these survivors provided investigators with an especially valuable description of the man who had approached her, including details about his appearance, his vehicle, and the area where he seemed to live. When detectives compared this information with the description previously supplied by Jan Susan Whitney's companion, they noticed striking similarities. Independent witnesses who had never met each other were describing what appeared to be the same individual. Although investigators still lacked sufficient evidence to make an arrest, they were finally moving beyond speculation. For the first time, the investigation was beginning to narrow toward a specific type of suspect rather than an unknown offender who could have been anyone. Every interview, every vehicle registration, and every surviving witness now assumed greater importance. Jerry Brudos remained unaware of how close investigators were coming. He continued presenting himself as the same quiet electrician, believing that years of secrecy had protected him. But the accumulated weight of witness testimony, recovered evidence, and careful investigative work was steadily closing the distance between suspicion and identification. In the weeks ahead, Oregon State Police would organize a far more coordinated effort, reviewing thousands of records, comparing witness accounts, and following every credible lead. The investigation that had begun with one unexplained disappearance was about to enter its decisive phase. And for the first time since January 1968, Jerry Bruttos would find himself becoming the focus of an increasingly determined search. The discovery of Linda Sally's body marked a decisive turning point in the investigation. Until that moment, detectives had been working through a series of disappearances that, while deeply troubling, offered limited physical evidence and few direct paths toward identifying a suspect. Now, with confirmation that at least one of the missing women had been murdered, the urgency surrounding the case increased dramatically. Law enforcement agencies across Oregon recognized that they were likely confronting an offender who posed an ongoing threat to young women. Every day that passed without an arrest carried the possibility that another victim could disappear. The investigation entered an entirely new phase, one defined by coordination, persistence, and the careful comparison of information gathered over many months. Investigators established a dedicated task force to focus on the growing number of connected cases. Rather than treating each disappearance as an isolated event, detectives began examining them collectively, searching for recurring patterns that might reveal the identity of the person responsible. The similarities became increasingly difficult to ignore. Each confirmed victim was a young woman. Each disappeared during ordinary daytime activities. None of the cases appeared to involve robbery as the primary motive. In several instances, rivers or waterways became associated with the disposal of the victims. While no single characteristic proved the existence of a serial killer, the accumulation of these common elements persuaded investigators that they were likely searching for one individual whose methods remained consistent despite differences in the circumstances of each abduction. The scope of the investigation expanded accordingly. Detectives began reviewing thousands of vehicle registrations, concentrating on automobiles matching descriptions provided by witnesses. Every report involving suspicious encounters with women was revisited. Individuals with histories of sexual offenses were examined. Authorities also reviewed records involving people who had previously undergone psychiatric treatment and who had demonstrated violent or sexually motivated behavior. None of these categories automatically identified a criminal, but together they provided investigators with a structured method for reducing an enormous pool of potential suspects. This painstaking work required patience rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Every lead had to be checked. Every statement had to be verified. Every possible connection required careful documentation. During this period, one of the investigation's most valuable sources of information came not from physical evidence, but from a woman who had survived an attempted abduction. According to the investigative record, Jerry Bruttos had attempted to kidnap at least 2 women during the period in which he committed the 4 confirmed murders. Unlike the victims whose lives had been taken, these women escaped before the attacks could progress further. One survivor, in particular, provided investigators with a remarkably detailed description of the man who had approached her. She described his physical appearance, the vehicle he drove, and the general area where he appeared to live. Her account became extraordinarily important because it was independent of every other witness. Interviewed during the investigation, detectives carefully compared her statement with information previously gathered during Jan Susan Whitney's disappearance. Whitney's companion had also provided a description of the man who offered roadside assistance, along with details about his automobile. Although the 2 witnesses had never met and described separate incidents, investigators recognized striking similarities between their accounts. The descriptions pointed toward the same general type of vehicle. They also reflected comparable observations regarding the driver's appearance. Individually, either statement might have been too general to identify a specific person. Together, however, they represented something far more significant. Independent witnesses were unknowingly describing what appeared to be the same man. This convergence of testimony strengthened investigators' confidence that the disappearances were connected and that they were gradually narrowing the field of potential suspects. Detectives continued tracing every available lead. Vehicle registrations became especially important because witnesses had consistently associated the unidentified man with a particular automobile. Investigators compared registration records, ownership histories, and geographic information in an effort to identify individuals whose circumstances matched the available evidence. This was painstaking work carried out long before computerized databases could instantly organize massive quantities of information. Records were reviewed manually, requiring considerable time and attention to detail. Nevertheless, each comparison brought investigators incrementally closer to a breakthrough. As information accumulated, one name began attracting increasing attention: Jerry Brudos. Several aspects of his background aligned with the developing investigative profile. He lived within the geographic area suggested by witness accounts. His vehicle corresponded with descriptions provided by multiple witnesses. Most importantly, his personal history contained warning signs that became increasingly relevant as detectives assembled a clearer picture of the offender they were seeking. Brudos had previously demonstrated violent behavior toward women, including assaults connected to his long-standing obsession with women's shoes. He had also spent time in psychiatric treatment following earlier criminal acts. None of these facts alone established guilt in the murders. Investigators understood that prior misconduct could never substitute for evidence. However, when combined with the witness descriptions and other developing information, Brudos emerged as a suspect worthy of closer examination. Surveillance and investigative efforts gradually focused more intensely on him while detectives continued gathering the evidence necessary to justify further action. Throughout this period, Jerry Brudos continued presenting himself as though nothing had changed. He maintained his employment as an electrician and continued living with his wife and children in Salem. Neighbors later reported noticing nothing unusual about his behavior. He remained quiet, polite, and seemingly ordinary. This ability to maintain an outward appearance of normality remained one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Even as investigators moved closer, Brudos gave little outward indication that he believed suspicion was falling upon him. Meanwhile, inside his home, the hidden garage continued concealing evidence accumulated over years. Unknown to investigators at that moment, the private room contained exactly the kind of physical proof that could connect him directly to the disappearances. The collection of women's shoes, clothing, camera equipment, restraints, and items associated with victims remained hidden behind closed doors, protected only by secrecy. Eventually, that secrecy would fail. As detectives continued comparing witness statements with registration records and background information, they developed sufficient grounds to seek further investigative action. The evidence had not emerged through a single dramatic discovery, but through the careful accumulation of many smaller pieces. A surviving victim's observations matched those of another witness. Vehicle descriptions pointed toward the same individual. Geographic patterns aligned with Brudos' residence. His documented history revealed behavior disturbingly consistent with aspects of the ongoing investigation. Step by step, the separate fragments formed an increasingly coherent picture. This methodical approach illustrates one of the defining strengths of successful criminal investigations. Rarely does a complex serial murder case hinge upon a single clue. More often, detectives solve such cases by assembling numerous independent facts, each insufficient on its own, but collectively overwhelming when viewed together. The investigation into Jerry Brudos followed precisely this pattern. Witnesses who believed they had observed only ordinary encounters unknowingly supplied essential information. Families who insisted their loved ones deserved continued investigation ensured that cases remained active. Detectives who refused to dismiss small inconsistencies gradually transformed isolated reports into compelling evidence. By late May 1969, investigators believed they were closing in on the man responsible for the disappearances that had haunted Oregon for more than a year. The next step required entering the place where Brudos had hidden his secret life from nearly everyone around him, armed with the authority to search his property. Detectives prepared to examine the home of the quiet electrician who had successfully concealed decades of obsession behind the appearance of an ordinary husband and father. What they would soon discover inside the garage exceeded even the expectations of experienced investigators. Hidden within that private room was a collection of evidence that would not only connect Jerry Brudos to multiple murders, but also reveal the disturbing motivations that had driven his crimes for years. The search of his home, followed by his arrest and eventual confession, would finally provide answers to families who had endured months of uncertainty while exposing one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in Oregon's history. By the final weeks of May 1969, the investigation had reached its most critical stage. For more than a year, detectives had pursued a series of disappearances that gradually evolved into one of Oregon's most disturbing homicide investigations. Every witness statement, every vehicle description, and every comparison between seemingly unrelated cases had narrowed the search. Jerry Brudos had emerged as a significant suspect, but investigators understood that suspicion alone was never enough to bring justice for the victims and secure a conviction in court. They needed physical evidence that directly connected him to the crimes. The next phase of the investigation would provide exactly that. Acting on the information they had gathered, investigators obtained legal authority to search Brudos' property in Salem. From the outside, the residence appeared no different from countless other family homes. It belonged to a working electrician, a husband, and a father whose daily routine had attracted little attention from neighbors. Nothing about the house itself suggested that it concealed evidence connected to multiple murders. Yet detectives entered the property aware that years of careful investigative work had brought them to this moment. They knew they were searching not only for objects but also for answers that grieving families had been waiting to receive. The search quickly focused on the section of the garage that Jerry Brudos had kept off limits. According to the investigation, even his wife had been forbidden from entering this private area. Over the years, Brudos had successfully isolated the room from the rest of the household, allowing him to conceal the life he lived beyond the reach of public view. When investigators finally entered the space, they discovered a collection of items unlike anything found during the earlier stages of the investigation. Carefully stored throughout the garage were hundreds of women's shoes, reflecting the obsession that had followed Brudos since childhood. Alongside them were numerous pieces of women's clothing and lingerie, preserved rather than discarded. Detectives also located camera equipment and photographs connected to the victims. Additional items associated with the missing women were recovered, creating direct links between Jerry Brudos and the crimes that had remained unsolved for months. Each object represented more than simple physical evidence. Together, they revealed the hidden world Brudos had constructed over many years. The garage was no ordinary workshop. It had become the private setting where his long-standing obsessions were preserved and where, according to the evidence collected during the investigation, many of his crimes had been carried out. The discovery confirmed what investigators had gradually suspected through witness statements and behavioral patterns. The offender they were searching for had not acted impulsively. He had created an environment dedicated to fulfilling the fantasies that had dominated his life. Since childhood, the evidence recovered during the search fundamentally changed the investigation. Until then, detectives had relied primarily upon witness testimony, vehicle descriptions, and comparisons between missing person cases. Now they possessed tangible proof connecting Brudos to multiple victims. Clothing, photographs, and personal belongings established relationships that could be presented in court. Investigators no longer faced the uncertainty that had characterized the early months of the case. Instead, they now had a substantial body of physical evidence supporting their conclusions. Shortly afterward, law enforcement moved to arrest Jerry Brudos. On May 29, 1969, officers located him hiding beneath a blanket inside the family vehicle while his wife was driving. The circumstances of the arrest stood in sharp contrast to the composed image Brudos had maintained. Throughout the investigation, for months he had continued working and living as though nothing had changed, presenting himself as a quiet family man. Now, confronted by law enforcement, his years of secrecy had come to an end. He was taken into custody without the lengthy search that investigators had once feared might become necessary. News of the arrest spread quickly throughout Oregon. Communities that had followed the disappearances with growing anxiety finally learned that police believed they had captured the man responsible. For the families of the victims, however, the arrest did not immediately provide closure. Many questions remained unanswered. They still needed to understand what had happened to their loved ones and whether investigators truly possessed sufficient evidence to establish the truth beyond doubt. Initially, Jerry Bruttos denied any involvement in the murders. Like many criminal suspects confronted with overwhelming allegations, he rejected responsibility despite the evidence recovered from his property. Detectives anticipated this possibility. They understood that successful interrogations rarely depended upon confrontation alone. Instead, investigators carefully presented the physical evidence collected during the search, comparing each discovery with information already established through witness statements and missing person investigations. The photographs recovered from the garage proved especially significant. Combined with personal belongings linked to the victims, they made denial increasingly difficult to sustain. As questioning continued, and investigators confronted Bruttos with the growing body of evidence, his position changed. Eventually, he admitted responsibility for the murders. According to the investigative record, Bruttos confessed not only to killing the victims, but also explained aspects of the sexual obsessions that had motivated his crimes. Most importantly, from a legal perspective, he provided information that only the perpetrator could have known. He directed investigators to locations where victims had been disposed of and described details that were independently confirmed through the ongoing investigation. Such information carried tremendous evidentiary value because it demonstrated firsthand knowledge, unavailable to anyone else. His admissions allowed detectives to reconstruct events that had remained mysteries for more than a year. The confession also confirmed the identities of victims whose disappearances had previously lacked definitive explanations. Linda Slauson's family, for example, finally learned what had happened after months of agonizing uncertainty. The same was true for the families of Jan Susan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally. Although no confession could lessen the profound loss they had experienced, it ended the painful uncertainty that accompanies unresolved disappearances. They no longer faced endless questions about where their loved ones might be or whether they could somehow still return home. The investigation also confirmed the disturbing progression that had characterized Bruttos' criminal behavior over many years. What had begun in childhood as an obsession with women's shoes gradually escalated into theft, assault, attempted kidnappings, and ultimately serial murder. Investigators and later behavioral experts emphasized that this progression illustrated an important pattern rather than an isolated series of unrelated acts. Bruttos' violence had intensified over time, demonstrating increasing levels of planning, control, and brutality. His crimes were not motivated by financial gain or personal disputes with the victims. Instead, according to his own admissions and the evidence recovered from his garage, they were driven by deeply rooted sexual obsessions and a desire to dominate those he targeted. Throughout the investigation, detectives remained careful to distinguish explanation from excuse. The psychiatric history uncovered during Bruttos' background investigation helped explain aspects of his behavior but did not diminish his responsibility. He had deliberately selected victims, concealed evidence, hidden his crimes, and attempted to avoid detection. Those actions demonstrated planning and awareness rather than an inability to distinguish right from wrong. This distinction would become especially important during the legal proceedings that followed. By the time investigators completed their work, the hidden double life Jerry Bruttos had maintained for years had been fully exposed. The quiet electrician admired by neighbors no longer existed as a believable public image. In its place stood overwhelming evidence of a serial murderer whose private obsessions had destroyed for young lives and devastated multiple families. The search of his garage, the evidence recovered inside, and his eventual confession transformed what had once seemed like unrelated disappearances into a complete account of one of Oregon's most infamous serial murder cases. Yet the criminal investigation represented only one stage of the pursuit of justice. The next chapter would unfold inside the courtroom, where psychiatrists would evaluate Brutto's mental condition, prosecutors would present the evidence gathered by investigators, and judges would determine whether his documented psychological disorders affected his criminal responsibility. The outcome of those proceedings would not only decide Jerry Brutto's future, but also establish his place in the history of American criminal justice and behavioral science. With Jerry Brutto's in custody and a substantial body of physical evidence recovered from his home, the investigation shifted from identifying the offender to preparing a case that could withstand legal scrutiny. Detectives had spent months assembling witness statements, documenting evidence, verifying timelines, and comparing Brutto's admissions with independently established facts. Every confession had to be supported wherever possible by physical evidence or information already known to investigators. This careful approach ensured that the prosecution would rely not simply on Brutto's own words but on a combination of corroborated evidence demonstrating his responsibility for the murders. The legal process that followed would examine not only what Brutto's had done, but also whether he possessed the mental capacity to be held fully responsible under the law. That question became one of the central issues as psychiatrists began evaluating him after his arrest. Jerry Brutto's psychological history was already well documented. Years before the murders, he had been committed to a psychiatric hospital following violent behavior connected to his obsession with women's shoes. Medical professionals at that time had diagnosed serious personality disturbances and recommended continued treatment. After his arrest for the murders, psychiatrists once again conducted extensive evaluations. They examined his long history of fetishistic behavior, his escalating pattern of violence, and the fantasies he later described during questioning. The evidence presented to mental health professionals painted the picture of an individual who had experienced severe sexual deviations and personality problems over many years. His fixation on women's shoes had begun in early childhood, expanded into compulsive theft during adolescence, progressed to assaults against women, and ultimately culminated in murder. By the time of his arrest, the fantasies driving his crimes had become inseparable from acts of domination and control over his victims. These findings were deeply disturbing, but they did not automatically determine his legal responsibility. In criminal proceedings, the existence of mental illness or psychological disorders does not necessarily mean that a defendant lacks criminal accountability. The crucial legal question centered on whether Brutto's understood the difference between right and wrong at the time he committed the murders. Psychiatric experts carefully considered this issue. According to the evaluations summarized during the legal process, Brutto's unquestionably suffered from multiple severe sexual disorders and personality disturbances. Nevertheless, the examining psychiatrists reached a consistent conclusion. Despite those disorders, he retained the ability to recognize that his actions were illegal and morally wrong. Several aspects of his behavior strongly supported that conclusion. Investigators had documented how Brutto's deliberately selected victims he did not personally know, reducing the likelihood that he would be identified through existing relationships. After each murder, he attempted to conceal evidence by disposing of bodies in rivers or other remote locations. In the case of Linda Sally, he even attached a heavy automobile transmission to the body in an effort to prevent it from resurfacing. He also maintained a hidden room inside his garage, carefully preventing even his wife from entering. These actions demonstrated planning, secrecy, and an awareness that discovery would lead to criminal consequences. Far from acting openly, Brudos consistently attempted to hide his crimes from law enforcement and from those closest to him. Forensic psychiatrists therefore concluded that although his psychological abnormalities were profound, they did not eliminate his understanding of reality or his awareness of the criminal nature of his conduct. This distinction became one of the defining features of the case. It illustrated that severe psychological disorders can exist alongside legal responsibility when an offender retains the capacity to understand and intentionally conceal criminal acts. As prosecutors prepared for court, they organized the evidence collected during the investigation into a comprehensive presentation. Physical items recovered from Brudos' garage connected him directly to the victims. Witnesses who had observed his interactions with Jan, Susan Whitney, and Karen Sprinker provided important testimony regarding the circumstances preceding their disappearances. Survivors of attempted abductions contributed descriptions of Brudos and his vehicle that had helped investigators identify him during the investigation. His own confession supplied additional details that only the perpetrator could have known, including information verified independently through investigative findings. Together, these elements created a compelling body of evidence that left little doubt regarding his responsibility. Rather than facing a trial dominated by factual uncertainty, Brudos ultimately chose to admit his guilt. On June 27, 1969, he entered guilty pleas to 3 counts of first-degree murder. Although investigators had established his responsibility for 4 confirmed victims, the available legal proceedings focused on 3 first-degree murder charges. The guilty pleas eliminated the need for a lengthy contested trial while ensuring that substantial punishment would follow. The court sentenced Jerry Brudos to 3 consecutive life sentences. The consecutive nature of those sentences reflected the gravity of the crimes and ensured that he would remain imprisoned for the remainder of his life. He would never again live outside the walls of a correctional institution. During the broader investigation, authorities also examined whether Brudos' wife possessed any knowledge of or involvement in his crimes. Given that many pieces of evidence had been recovered from the family home, investigators carefully considered whether she had assisted him or knowingly concealed criminal conduct. Ultimately, however, the allegations against her were dismissed, and she was found not guilty. The investigation concluded that the hidden activities carried out inside the private garage had remained concealed from her, consistent with evidence that Brudos had forbidden her from entering the area where much of the incriminating material was stored. For the families of the victims, the conclusion of the legal proceedings represented a complex mixture of relief and enduring grief. The guilty pleas removed uncertainty regarding who had committed the murders. The sentences ensured that Brudos would never again have the opportunity to harm other women. Yet no judicial outcome could restore the lives that had been lost. Linda Slauson remained forever 19 years old. Jan Susan Whitney never returned from what had begun as a simple roadside encounter. Karen Sprinker would never continue the studies she had begun as a chemistry student. Linda Sally's ordinary drive ended in unimaginable violence after responding to what appeared to be an innocent request for directions. Their futures had been permanently erased, leaving families to rebuild lives forever altered by loss. Jerry Brudos spent the remainder of his life incarcerated within the Oregon State Penitentiary. Decades passed while the case gradually became part of the historical records studied by investigators, criminologists, and behavioral scientists. On March 28, 2006, he died in prison from liver cancer at the age of 67. His death closed the final chapter of his personal story, but it did not diminish the lasting significance of the investigation itself. The Brudos case continued attracting attention, not because of the notoriety of the offender, but because of what it revealed about the progression of violent criminal behavior and the importance of recognizing escalating patterns before they culminate in repeated homicide. Over time, the investigation also became influential within the emerging field of behavioral analysis. As the Federal Bureau of Investigation expanded its study of serial offenders during the following decades, Jerry Brito's crimes became one of the documented cases used to better understand offenders driven primarily by sexual gratification and fantasies of domination, rather than financial motives or personal revenge. His history demonstrated a gradual escalation extending from fetishistic theft to assault, attempted kidnappings, and ultimately serial murder. That progression offered investigators valuable insights into behavioral development, victim selection, and offender motivation. Yet despite the academic importance of the case, the central lesson remained profoundly human. Behind every psychological evaluation, investigative report, and courtroom proceedings stood 4 young women whose ordinary lives ended because they encountered a man who concealed extraordinary violence beneath an ordinary appearance. Their stories remain the true foundation of the case, reminding future investigators, researchers, and the public that the ultimate purpose of studying crimes like these is not to glorify those who commit them, but to understand them well enough to better protect potential victims in the future. The case of Jerry Brito's remained one of the most disturbing examples of a serial murder investigation in Oregon, not only because of the number of victims, but because of the psychological path that led to the crimes. Long after the courtroom proceedings ended and the headlines disappeared, investigators, psychiatrists, and criminal behavior specialists continued examining the case as an example of how violent fantasies can escalate over time when combined with secrecy, obsession, and a desire for control. Yet behind the descriptions of psychological disorders, investigative procedures, and courtroom evidence were 4 individual women whose lives were permanently taken away. Understanding the case requires remembering that the story is not defined by the offender alone. It is also the story of the victims, the families who search for answers, and the investigators who work to uncover the truth. Linda Slauson, Jan Susan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally each had their own lives, relationships, and futures before their paths crossed with Jerry Brito's. Their disappearances initially appeared unrelated because they occurred in different circumstances. One woman was working as a salesperson. Another encountered a stranger while dealing with a vehicle problem. Another disappeared while shopping. Another was approached while driving. These were ordinary moments, the types of situations that occur every day without danger. The tragedy of the case was that Brito's exploited precisely those ordinary situations. He relied on trust, politeness, and routine human interactions to approach women who had no reason to believe they were in danger. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern that had been hidden beneath these separate events. The murders were not random acts without connection. They represented a consistent behavioral pattern shaped by Brito's long-standing obsessions and his need for control. From childhood, his fascination with women's shoes had developed into a deeply abnormal fixation. Over the years, the behavior progressed from collecting objects to stealing them, then to assaulting women, and eventually to murder. This gradual escalation became one of the most important aspects of the case studied by behavioral experts. It demonstrated that violent offenders do not always emerge suddenly. In many cases, there may be a progression of warning signs that increase in severity over time. In Brito's history, those signs appeared repeatedly. His early thefts, his assault as a teenager, his psychiatric hospitalization, and his later attacks against women all represented stages in a pattern that became increasingly dangerous. However, the case also demonstrated the difficulty of identifying such patterns before the most serious crimes occur. By the time Brito's was arrested, investigators could clearly see the connections between earlier behaviors and later murders. Before that point, however, many events had been viewed separately. Criminal investigations often operate under uncertainty. Detectives must distinguish between suspicious behavior and evidence strong enough to justify legal action. They must avoid assuming guilt without proof while also recognizing when separate incidents may form a larger pattern. The Brito's investigation ultimately succeeded because investigators continued comparing information, rather than allowing each disappearance to remain isolated. Witness statements, vehicle descriptions, surviving victims' accounts, and physical evidence recovered from the garage all contributed pieces of the same puzzle. No single piece solved the case by itself. Instead, the investigation succeeded through the accumulation of many connected facts. One of the most significant lessons from the case was the importance of survivor testimony. While 4 women lost their lives, some potential victims escaped Brutto's attempts to harm them. Their accounts provided investigators with critical information about his appearance, his vehicle, and his methods of approaching women. Those details helped connect him to earlier disappearances and demonstrated the value of listening carefully to survivors. Their experiences contributed directly to preventing further violence and helped law enforcement identify the person responsible. The physical evidence discovered in Brutto's garage also became a defining element of the investigation. The hidden room represented years of concealed behavior. Investigators found collections and materials that revealed the extent of his obsession and linked him directly to the victims. The discovery transformed the case from a matter of suspicion into one supported by undeniable evidence. It also exposed the extreme separation between Brutto's public and private identities. To neighbors and co-workers, he was a quiet electrician and family man. Inside the private space he had carefully protected, investigators found evidence of a completely different reality. This contrast became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. It demonstrated how some offenders can maintain ordinary social roles while hiding deeply destructive behavior. The psychiatric evaluations conducted after his arrest also contributed to the broader understanding of the case. Experts recognized that Brutto suffered from severe psychological disorders, particularly involving sexual deviation and personality disturbance. However, they also concluded that he understood the difference between right and wrong. His efforts to conceal evidence, avoid detection, and maintain secrecy demonstrated awareness of the criminal nature of his actions. This conclusion was central to the legal outcome because it established that his psychological problems did not remove his responsibility. The case therefore became an example of the distinction between understanding why someone commits a crime and determining whether that person is legally accountable. In later years, researchers studying serial offenders frequently reference Brutto's as an example of what became known as a lust murder case. The term refers to crimes where the primary motivation involves sexual fantasy, domination, and control rather than traditional motives such as money or revenge. In Brutto's case, investigators determined that the victims were not selected because of personal conflicts or financial value. Instead, they were targeted because they represented elements connected to his fantasies. The concept became important in the development of criminal profiling and behavioral analysis, fields that attempted to better understand how offenders select victims and how their behaviors evolve. However, the academic study of such crimes carries an important responsibility. Understanding an offender's psychology should never shift attention away from the victims or transform criminals into figures of fascination. The purpose of studying cases like Brutto's is prevention, not admiration. The most meaningful information gained from the investigation comes from recognizing warning signs, improving investigative methods, and finding ways to protect people before violence occurs. Jerry Brutto's died on March 28, 2006, while serving his life sentences in prison. He died from liver cancer at the age of 67, having spent decades incarcerated. His death ended the life of a man responsible for unimaginable suffering. But it did not erase the impact of his crimes. For the families of the victims, the loss remained permanent. The passing of the offender could not return the years stolen from their loved ones or undo the pain caused by his actions. The final legacy of the case should therefore belong not to Jerry Brutto's, but to the women whose lives ended because of him. Their names represent more than evidence in an investigation. They represent people who had dreams, families, relationships, and futures that mattered. The story of Jerry Brudos is ultimately a reminder of how hidden violence can exist behind ordinary appearances and how important it is for communities and investigators to recognize patterns before they become tragedies. It is also a reminder that every criminal case is more than a story about the person who committed the crime. At its center are the people who were harmed and the families who continue carrying the consequences long after the investigation ends. The work of law enforcement, psychologists, and researchers may help society understand cases like this one, but the deepest responsibility remains honoring the victims and ensuring that their lives are remembered beyond the crimes that ended them. The story of Jerry Brudos is remembered as one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Oregon history, not simply because of the violence he committed, but because of the way that violence remained hidden behind the appearance of an ordinary life. For years, Brudos lived among neighbors, co-workers, and family members who saw only the version of himself that he chose to present. He was an electrician, a husband, and a father. He followed routines that appeared familiar and harmless. Yet behind that public identity existed a private world shaped by obsession, secrecy, and increasingly dangerous behavior. The investigation that eventually exposed him demonstrated how difficult it can be to recognize a predator who does not fit the image people expect. Brudos did not appear as an obvious threat. He did not openly display the violence that would later define his name. Instead, he maintained a carefully controlled separation between his everyday life and the crimes he committed. That contrast became one of the most significant lessons drawn from the case. The beginning of Brudos' criminal history could be traced back decades before the murders. His fascination with women's shoes began during childhood and gradually developed into an intense fixation. According to the psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest, early experiences, including his relationship with his mother and feelings of rejection, were considered contributing factors in the development of his abnormal behavior. However, those experiences did not determine his actions. Many people experienced difficult childhood circumstances without becoming violent offenders. The significance of Brudos' history was not simply that he had unusual interests, but that those interests developed into repeated criminal behavior and eventually into acts of extreme violence. As a teenager, he stole women's shoes and committed assaults in order to obtain them. His actions resulted in psychiatric treatment, yet after leaving care, he continued living a seemingly ordinary life without addressing the dangerous patterns that had already appeared. The years that followed revealed how successfully he could hide those patterns. His marriage and employment created an image of stability. Those around him had little reason to suspect that the man they knew publicly was concealing behavior that would later shock the entire state. The murders committed between January 1968 and April 1969 marked the final stage of that escalation. Each victim was a young woman whose life was interrupted during an ordinary moment. Linda Slauson was working as a salesperson when she encountered Brudos. Jan Susan Whitney accepted assistance from a man who appeared willing to help after her vehicle experienced problems. Karen Sprinker was a student whose disappearance began with a normal day of shopping. Linda Sally was driving when Brudos approached her by pretending to need directions. None of these women entered those situations expecting danger. Their deaths were not the result of conflicts they had created or choices that placed them in harm's way. They were targeted by someone who deliberately exploited everyday interactions. Remembering this point is essential when examining the case. The responsibility belonged entirely to Jerry Brudos. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement faced the difficult challenge of connecting crimes that initially appeared unrelated. There was no single dramatic discovery that immediately solved the case. Instead, the breakthrough came through persistence and careful comparison. Witness accounts, especially from survivors of attempted abductions, became increasingly important. Descriptions of Brudos and his vehicle helped investigators establish connections between different incidents. The recovery of Linda Sally's body increased pressure on law enforcement and provided additional evidence that the disappearances were linked. Each piece of information strengthened the developing picture of a serial offender operating in the region. The eventual search of Bruto's home represented the moment when the hidden reality behind his public identity was revealed. Inside the private area of his garage, investigators discovered evidence that connected him to the murders and demonstrated the depth of his obsession. The items recovered showed that his crimes were not isolated acts, but part of a larger pattern of behavior that had developed over many years. The garage became a physical representation of the life he had hidden from everyone around him. It contained the evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty and allowed investigators to provide answers to families who had spent months searching for the truth. Bruto's confession after his arrest provided additional information about the crimes. He admitted responsibility and guided investigators to locations connected to the disposal of victims. These statements were significant because they included details that only the person responsible could have known. His admissions helped confirm what investigators had already begun establishing through physical evidence and witness testimony. The legal proceedings that followed focused not only on the facts of the murders, but also on the question of Bruto's mental state. Psychiatric experts acknowledged that he suffered from serious psychological disorders, including severe sexual deviations and personality disturbances. However, they concluded that he understood the difference between right and wrong and was capable of recognizing the criminal nature of his actions. His attempts to conceal evidence, hide his activities, and avoid detection demonstrated awareness and planning. As a result, the court determined that his psychological problems did not remove his responsibility for the crimes. On June 27, 1969, Bruto's pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and received 3 consecutive life sentences. The outcome ensured that he would remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. While the legal process brought accountability, it could not undo the damage suffered by the victims' families. A conviction can establish the truth and provide justice within the legal system, but it cannot restore the future that was taken from those who died. The families of Linda Slauson, Jan Susan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally continued living with losses that no sentence could repair. In the decades after the case ended, Jerry Brutos became a subject of study among criminal psychologists and investigators. His crimes were examined as an example of a lust murder pattern, where the offender's motivation involves sexual fantasy, domination, and control rather than financial gain or personal revenge. Researchers studied how his behavior escalated from early fetishistic crimes to increasingly violent acts. The case contributed to broader discussions about criminal profiling and the importance of understanding offender behavior. However, the value of studying such cases lies not in focusing on the offender's notoriety, but in learning how similar crimes might be prevented in the future. The most important lessons from the Brutos investigation involve recognizing escalation, valuing survivor testimony, maintaining careful investigative cooperation, and understanding that outward normality does not always reflect inner reality. The case demonstrated that dangerous behavior can remain hidden for years when offenders successfully separate their public and private lives. It also showed the importance of persistence by investigators who continue searching for connections, even when evidence appears limited. Jerry Brutos died in prison on March 28, 2006, from liver cancer. He was 67 years old and had spent the majority of his later life behind bars. His death ended the story of the offender, but it did not end the importance of remembering the victims. The final chapter of this case should not be defined by the person who caused suffering, but by the lives that were lost and the families forever changed. Linda Slauson, Jan Susan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally were more than names in a criminal investigation. They were individuals with families, ambitions, and futures that mattered. Their stories remain the central reason the case continues to be studied. The investigation into Jerry Brutos serves as a reminder that behind every criminal case are real, people whose lives extend far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. The purpose of examining such tragedies is not to give attention to the person responsible, but to understand how violence develops, how investigations succeed, and how society can better protect those who may one day become victims. The legacy of the case is therefore not the darkness created by Jerry Brudos. It is the commitment to remembering the victims, learning from the investigation, and ensuring that their lives are never reduced only to the crimes committed against them.